It's arguably Samaya, and this is Doom Propheteering, a show where I get to talk about current events that I haven't already covered on my TikTok. That is correct. I'm finally starting a podcast. This has been a really long time coming. I know that people have been asking me to start one of these for a very long time, and I'm finally getting off my butt to do so. So this is basically just going to be me like looking at different articles from the week that I didn't get to for whatever reason on my TikTok and giving my opinions on that, or it's just going to be me talking about like whatever I think is relevant or pertinent at the time. We're going to have fun with it. Trust the process. Let's not spend too much time on the introduction. Let's actually just jump right in because I actually have a lot that I want to talk about. The first one is an article from AP. It was posted like a couple hours ago. This is on Friday, March 14th. And it's about the economy. I want to talk about the economy first. The headline is Wall Street rallies to its best day in months, but that's not enough to salvage its losing week. And basically, it's about, the stock market recovering from like the pain that Trump put it through with the whole tariffs back and forth nonsense. And indeed, they say in the article, to be sure, the heaviest uncertainty remains with Trump's escalating trade war. Question is how much pain Trump will let the economy endure through tariffs and other policies in order to reshape the country and the world as he wants. I would like to say I still don't think there is a good explanation for Donald Trump's tariff flip-flops. I know a lot of people have been saying like he's trying to manipulate the market so that his like rich friends and himself can buy stocks low and then sell high. And interesting theory, but I think that's a bit too organized, like a bit too intellectual for what's going on here. Because I think if you attribute that level of like intelligence and forethought to Donald Trump, like it still doesn't make sense why he's not using these tariffs in any more strategic way because they are an international policy. And there's a lot that he could be doing to achieve like international foreign policy goals with them that he's just not doing. For like with Mexico, he's like kowtowing to Claudia Sheinbaum, my absolute goat, the president of Mexico, even though he could be like getting a lot more immigration concessions from these tariffs. So I don't know, like, okay, sure, he's manipulating the market to be like more favorable to his rich friends. I still don't even know if it's necessarily the case that this kind of uncertainty is that useful. And, they say in the article too, US households and businesses have already reported drops in confidence because of all the uncertainties caused by Trump's barrage of on again, off again tariff announcements and other policies that's raised fears about a pullback in spending that could sap energy from the economy. And this is sort of my overall takeaway from this. I think we are being driven into a recession. I don't know if Trump realizes that that's what he's doing, but these are the things that create the conditions for a massive recession. I think we're looking at a recession possibly even worse than 2008, which is not what, you want to hear, but I think that's the case. And so, like, when a recession is not good necessarily for the wealthy, unless, of course, you have an oligarch in office who is willing to bail out the wealthy, which we do have. So, I'm really not sure, like, what the strategy exactly here is. Like, I think people assign a lot more intelligence to Donald Trump than I think is necessarily pertinent because I just can't see, like, a good strategy out of this like economic turbulence because remember, even a downturning economy is still good for capitalists, but it's uncertainty that's really problematic because like capitalists operate on quarterly bases. If they don't know what their quarterly earnings are going to be looking like, if they can't predict the stock market, like being able to predict the stock market is kind of the whole point of a lot of like the financial sector where Donald Trump makes so much of his money, where a lot of his friends work. And so like not being able to predict the stock market having these very erratic rises and falls, I don't think that's actually helpful for like Donald Trump's friends. I think just a precipitous decline, maybe you could like explain that away, but this kind of nonsense just really doesn't make sense. And I think it is ultimately going to land us in a recession, which is really dangerous. And I saw some reporting that was, confirming that like, oh, it looks like the United States is probably headed into a recession. Other things that don't bode well for the future of the United States, though, there's an article out by The Hill that was released on the 10th of March. This is headline: U.S. added to Human Rights Watch List over Trump moves. And basically, there's this group there that tracks human rights in different countries, Civicus, and they have a monitor list of countries that have like a threat level to human rights. And the United States is now being added to that watch list. Countries that are experiencing like a precipitous decline in human rights. We join Congo, Italy, Pakistan, and Serbia, which is, obviously not ideal. But they say restrictive executive orders, unjustifiable institutional cutbacks, and intimidation tactics through threatening pronouncements by senior officials in the administration are creating an atmosphere to chill democratic dissent, a cherished American ideal. And they also say the Trump administration seems hell-bent on dismantling the system of checks and balances, which are the pillars of a democratic society. And, all of this is definitely correct. My sort of one question is, how is it possible, genuinely, that the United States has not been on human rights watch lists? This is why I really can't take quote-unquote human rights watch lists very seriously, especially the ones done by, like, the equivalent of like America Burger, Freedom Institute, like Freedom House, because it's basically built to reflect the opinions of the American liberal world order. And anything that doesn't fit into that, like human rights abuses that don't fit into the paradigm of the liberal world order, are basically unrecognizable, which is absurd. Like the United States has had concentration camps, right, in the form of immigration detention centers. That is not a factor in calculating our human rights score or whatever. The United States government has a really high level of police going around killing people who are unarmed and pose no threat. In fact, I think it was 2024 where we saw another record for police killings. That as well just does not factor in, partially because these things continue under Democratic administrations, and in the liberal world order, Democrats can essentially do basically no wrong, which is really stupid. But yeah, I mean there are so like America has the highest prison population of any country. We have 25% of the world's prisoners. It just does not make any sort of sense that it's only now that we're being added to this like human rights watchdog list. And also, I feel like one of the strategies that like liberalism uses to keep its more dire crimes from like factoring into their own consideration of themselves. And this is like the entirety of like the liberal world institutional order. I'm talking about things like the ICC and like ICJ, et cetera, et cetera. Like foreign policy is basically never a factor. Like the human rights watch list is only ever calculated within our borders. But the worst aspects of United States human rights policy happen outside of our borders, happen overseas, happen, due to the military industrial complex and almost 800 military bases around the world. It doesn't make sense that you can judge the human rights of the United States based on how we treat our domestic population. Now, the way we treat our domestic population, still not good, right? Still not ideal. But also, the way that we treat other people overseas needs to be a factor, and this basically does not acknowledge any of that. Like, the United States is actively funding a genocide. Does that count in, I feel like that kind of matters when you're putting together a human rights watch list. The last thing I'll say on this topic is that within like the liberal international human rights framework, there's a difference between positive rights and negative rights. Positive rights are basically things that the government is meant to provide for you, things that the government is meant to create an environment in which these rights can flourish like actively. This is an active duty of the government, whereas negative rights are things that the government is supposed to refrain from doing to you. So like a positive right is the right to food, right to education, the right to a well-paying job. Whereas, a negative right would be the right to not be put in jail for political speech. The United States tends to do pretty well when it comes to negative rights, and indeed, a lot of the like liberal international framework is structured around how well you follow by negative rights. But positive rights are basically never factored in. And you have this UN convention on cultural, social, and economic rights. And the United States fails at a whole lot of those. So there's a whole side of human rights that the United States basically disregards, but because obviously, liberalism and capitalism has dominated the human rights framework, the international human rights framework, that basically doesn't get counted in. And it's pretty unfortunate that that's the case. Anyway, let's move on to another story that is tangentially related to the sort of college crackdowns that are happening now in regards to Palestine and pro-Palestinian activism. A story from the Middle East Eye. A Muslim scholar of international law barred from Yale University after AI-powered accusation. I think this is like the sign of our impending doom. Like, this is the most dystopian thing potentially ever. Like, this was a story that came out on the 13th of March. And basically, this young Iranian Muslim scholar of international law was like brought into Yale, and then they were basically barred from the campus because of an AI powered news site accusing this person of basically being involved with the Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network, which was declared a terrorist group in Canada and has been sanctioned in the United States. Basically, this AI network called this person a terrorist. And Yale basically did not do any investigation into this incredibly suspect source. There's a couple things like wrong with this entire sequence of events. Number one, being involved with the Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network. Why the hell is that problematic? Like, seriously, we're criminalizing prisoner solidarity networks? Basically, they have been kidnapped by an occupying force that has destroyed their country and laid waste to them for over 75 years. And like, if you live in the West, you cannot have solidarity with these prisoners. Like, that's absurd, number one. Number two, the AI website that is doing this quote unquote investigation, I think, like, I've said this before on my TikTok, AI is not actually supposed to find correct results. Like, the use of AI in whenever you're dealing with things like these is not that they want to actually figure out like who is, doing X thing. The same thing happens with Israel's targeting program where they tried to figure out, oh my gosh, we have all these drones, but we really don't want humans to like man them. Let's try out this AI thing that will artificially, like using artificial intelligence, identify people who are quote unquote terrorists, and the drones will then carry out that attack. They like if you look at the statistics and the results for that drone program, it's absolutely horrible. Like, it basically cannot differentiate between, a militant and a civilian. But Israel keeps using this program. The reason being, they don't really care. Like, you know, it's not actually a problem for them if they kill civilians, as I think we have seen quite clearly. Um, I think the same thing is kind of going on here, where when you have like institution like Yale is not like a stupid institution. So when you have institutions like this, basically like relinquish these like very serious responsibilities over to these AI programs. Um, like the reason like that this stuff happens is not because like the people involved are stupid. It's because the people involved like this is the intended outcome. Like the AI simply provides an excuse for this kind of essentially widespread racial profiling because like AI again is trained to spot patterns. And, patterns can very easily turn into things like racial profiling, which I personally think is what happens when you use AI to do this kind of thing. And the Trump administration is doing something similar where they're trying to use AI to like identify visa holders and I guess now green card holders who, have been outspokenly quote unquote anti-Israel, where they're using AI to try and identify those people to deport them. That basically just devolves into technological racial profiling. This is sort of, I think, a similar case where it's simply like using technology as a justification to remove Muslim and Arab academics from public life. And it's really gross. It's really disgusting. And again, like I think it just reminds us that like the American higher education system, we put so much like regard in it. And in many respects, like the American higher education system is very good and needs to be protected. And obviously, like it being targeted by the government is not what you want to happen. But these like colleges that are supposed to be like bastions of education and bastions of knowledge are really just hedge funds that have libraries, right? So it's important to like remember like these people are not acting in the best faith effectively ever. So let's move on then. A couple of political election articles for us. The first one is on Tim Walz. He basically came out fiery and was saying, we wouldn't be in this mess if we had won the election. He's basically lambasting the Harris campaign strategy. And he said something that was very interesting. He said, we have to make sure that Americans know it's not just Donald Trump is bad, but we're offering them something better. And I think that's what we need to work on. Now, if you have listened to any of my Democrats' bad rants over the past few effectively years at this point, you will understand why I find that incredibly interesting. Listen, I got called everything but a child of God on the internet for saying literally exactly this, that it's not just enough to say that Trump is bad, but be copying so many of his strategies. Like the Democrats need to paint an alternate vision. And yet, it's only when this guy comes out and says it that this gets taken seriously. It's really not that hard to analyze politics. Like I feel like it's really not that hard. Like when you just look at like the size of the drop off and the areas in which like the drop off was most severe in terms of like the election numbers, like these are all people, specifically like young men and Latinos, like these are people who were in the Democratic Party coalition because of economic populism. Like they'll tell you that over and over again. It's not because of any sort of like social draw. And so when you drop the economic populism, of course these people then leave the party for, the other party, the Republicans that are offering them something similar, offering them like, oh, we have economic populism over here. Of course, right-wing economic populism is inherently like contradictory and doesn't make any sense, but they are going to follow wherever you promise them material change. And so, like, the entire Harris campaign was based on the idea that we're going to preserve the institutions versus, like, and this guy wants to break the institutions. But nobody likes the institutions. Nobody trusts the institutions. There is a profound sense within Americans that government is just not working. And so you have to offer people something else, literally anything else. Like, offer them programs that are going to fundamentally change their lives. And this is why, like, this particular quote from Tim Walz was very interesting, but then he goes on to say, like, look, I'm conservative. I believe that systems work for a long time, that you don't have to break them. He said, are there improvements that need to be done? Yes, and I think we're guilty of sometimes not acting. Like, this just cements to me the idea that the Democrats are fundamentally incapable of, like, meeting this moment ever. And, I thought Tim Walz was a good pick for vice president. This just is not, like, the correct attitude. Like, even in his acknowledgement that the Democrats basically didn't do enough to show people that they, like, could be the party of change, he's still saying, oh, but at the same time, we don't need to fundamentally change the systems. Like, this is a message that would have been effective maybe, like, post 2020, probably would have been most effective in, like, 2016, even, like, like, right after the Obama era. Like, this is a message that just is too late. Like, you've already tied yourself so tightly to the institutions as a party. Like, the Democrats just can't change. And even now, they're saying, like, oh, we don't need to, like, fundamentally change the systems. Guys, I don't know if you realize the systems are going to fundamentally change whether you are on board or not. It is just time to pick the direction in which they're going to change. The Democrats still can't acknowledge that, which is why I still think they're not a viable pathway. And electoralism in general is just, like, not a viable pathway so long as the Democrats are standing in the way of any sort of forward marching progress. Last thing we're going to talk about really quickly, the entire Chuck Schumer debacle, voting for the closure so that the Republicans can pass their incredibly harmful budget bill to keep the government open. Another The Hill report from the 14th. Schumer brushes off leadership questions. My caucus and I are in sync. He's basically saying, look, he's the obviously Democratic Senator Minority Leader. He's basically saying, look, guys, everyone and their mom is calling for me to resign, for me to be primaried. J.B. Pritzker came out and said that he would, you know, look for somebody to replace me. But guys, don't worry. I totally have it all under control. The Democrats are totally still behind me. Listen, when you've lost Will Stansel, like, when you have lost, like, Olivia Juliana, like, the Democratic Party loyalists, like, unpaid DNC interns, paid DNC operatives are coming out and saying that you are basically a traitor to the American people. There is no way that you can recover the situation. Like, it just doesn't work. So, him and I think this is, like, an endemic problem to the Democrats. Like, the Democrats have a problem of valuing seniority over essentially everything else. And this is a key example of this. Like, he thinks he can just coast out of this, like, controversy, not recognizing that they are, like, as a party, the Democrats are in an existential moment. And, I think I said this, like, on my TikTok, but just from the top to bottom, what he did here was a political disaster. And I think it was pre-planned. Like, the decision to basically not come out and say that you were going to vote for the closure, even though you had so much time to deliberate whether or not it was a good or bad idea, so much time to communicate to the Democratic voter base, like, why this was an acceptable decision. It's not just like bad politics in the sense of like, oh, you're collaborating with the Republicans. It's like on the level of being an active conspirator against the American people. Like, you intentionally did this so close to the deadline so that basically, you wouldn't have to face so much pushback, or that you knew that this was going to be an unpopular decision, and basically you weren't interested in listening to the feelings of the people you're meant to represent. So, like, Chuck Schumer is just an example of why the Democrats just literally cannot meet this moment. They are so interested. They always have time to collaborate with the Republicans to make sure their agenda goes smoothly. This is something they've done basically forever, as long as certainly I've been alive, and probably you as well. Like, they are just not on our side. Like, that's the pinnacle problem here. They're just not interested in democracy, which is ironic because, of course, they are Democrats, but they are infinitely more hostile to listening to their base than the Republicans are listening to their base. And so, like, you just can't move forward when you have a party that is only ever proficient at like political maneuvering when they are trying to subvert the will of their own voters. So yeah, that was just a couple headlines that I saw that were interesting that I wanted to either expound upon or like touch on that I didn't really get to through the week. This podcast is probably going to hopefully be a weekly thing. We'll see how it goes. Um yeah, so that's been Doom Profiteering with arguably Samaya. I'll see you guys next week.